One thing with the new setup, greater mobility with this desk here. The other setup I had, it was a lot harder to move it around and change camera angle. Much more of a pain. This one's much easier. So, yeah, camera angles will change. Apologize that the microphone's showing up in the frame, which is blocking where shadow is, but you can still see them right there. All right. So yesterday we got some idea for how the playoffs might look, and I had Tampa and Washington in the wrong spots, and I apologize for that. So here's where the format is, and okay, so which teams could benefit or not benefit from this setup? Well, if your team has to play their way in, it's going to feel like you're being punished. But the teams that were further down, in all likelihood, probably don't go that far in the playoffs. Now, for Toronto fans, this has to be really frustrating because it looked like finally in the first round of a playoffs they'd avoid Boston. Now, the play-in is not round one. The best of five play-in is not considered round one. It is considered a matchup to decide who makes it into round one. And so Toronto and Columbus will play each other for the right to play Boston in all likelihood. Although these seeds aren't completely set in stone either. There's some talk about whether or not there's going to be a tournament between the four seeds to decide who the top seed is. I'm going to say this. Boston, as the number one seed, and for Bruins fans, they're like, oh man, we were so far ahead, and why don't we would have had home ice the whole way through the playoffs. Hey, how does that President's Trophy do for people? Right. President's Trophy doesn't go very well. So don't worry about home ice advantage. And in these playoffs, home ice doesn't really mean anything. And that's one thing that, you know what, honestly, I find that kind of more interesting to me, that home ice, it's not really a thing now. It's just may the best man win. And, we'll see how that goes. So Toronto would play Columbus, Pittsburgh would play Montreal. And rumor has it that they were going to do a best of three, and that Carey Price and his ability to steal a series might be why it's best of five instead. I don't know that I buy that theory that Carey Price is that dangerous, or that means that other goalies aren't. Case in point, Shesterkin in New York. He's willing and capable, and of course you got Bobrovsky in Florida. He could be, absolutely capable of stealing a series over the Islanders. So we could see a situation where Pittsburgh and Philly meet in the official first round of the playoffs. Carolina meets Washington, and Florida could play Tampa Bay. So we could get the Battle of Florida for the first time in the playoffs. And in all honesty, I think the team that stands to lose the most is, I want to say Pittsburgh, but since they'll have Gensel back, maybe not Pittsburgh. And in their favor, keep in mind Ty Domi's diabetic. We've talked about whether or not certain players might or might not play. I would think that being diabetic, and since that is a high-risk group, I don't think he plays. I'd be very surprised if Domi plays until we have a treatment that's going to mean that he doesn't have to worry about his health. And there may be other players as well. Think along the lines of players who've had cancer treatments. So you've got Lindblom in Philly. Probably doesn't play another game, even if his treatments are finished and he feels fine. Probably doesn't play another game until we have some sort of treatment. And for players with, could just be asthma too. So that's going to be an ongoing story, and that's something that's not necessarily going to be any different next season than this season. So again, think of this as a trial run for next season, because we don't know things are going to be better next season. I was listening to Brian Burke yesterday, talking about how they need to nail down next season, and I kind of understood until he said they have to have the availability dates for all 31 buildings, and they have to nail down the availability dates for all 31 buildings and come up with a schedule and go from there. Well, no, because we don't know that availability dates are going to be any different in October than they are right now, and we don't know what is going to happen. So in this era of we just don't know what may or may not happen, the longer you can wait to schedule out next season, the better prepared you probably are. So it's the reason you don't pack for vacation 3 months before you go unless you really, really want to go. In which case, it'd be the bags I didn't unpack after Disney with the idea that, well, we're going to Vegas in March anyways. And then we didn't go to Vegas in March. So then I had to unpack and get rid of the suitcases, which just... Anyways. Now, interesting matchups that could happen. You could have Boston and Philadelphia in the final 8. You could have Washington and Tampa in the final 8 as well. You could have Carolina and Tampa an old Southeastern Division matchup. You could have Columbus against Montreal in one that would make everybody angry. Columbus versus Toronto is going to be fascinating if that's where we end up. In that, like, if this is the format they agree to. Because Columbus is going to be healthy, and Toronto's going to feel a lot of pressure coming out of this, as Toronto always does. But one thing I'm wondering is, will Canadian teams who normally feel all of this pressure in the playoffs, does some of that maybe get mitigated by the reality that there won't be the fans in the stands, and maybe they won't feel that day-to-day pressure, and maybe that favors a Canadian team winning a Stanley Cup for the first time since 1993, right? Now, out west, we've got Calgary and Winnipeg deciding who's going to play St. Louis. That means Winnipeg could play St. Louis in what officially would be round one again. You could have Edmonton against Dallas, which is, resurrecting an old feud. But, of course, Chicago. Chicago legit scares me. You've got Kane and Taves and Keith, and all these guys are going to be really well-rested. Crawford, well-rested. And an Oilers team that did very, very well unexpectedly this year. So maybe Edmonton is that team that stands to lose the most here. And Nashville and Arizona, that's the lifeline Arizona's needed. And Nashville looked excellent going into the break, but all that momentum's kind of broken. Vancouver and Minnesota, and one that could be very interesting in my house. My wife being a Minnesota fan, myself being a Vancouver fan. That could be fascinating, and then whoever wins that series gets to play Colorado. And again, for Vegas fans, this bracket means all new frustrations and feuds. So playing the winner of Nashville versus Arizona, one of the matchups I wanted to see was Nashville versus Vegas, just for seeing the two fan bases back and forth. Now, you won't see it in the building, but you could see that online, and that could be absolutely fun to watch. And then, of course, the winner of that series would play probably Colorado. I can't see Minnesota or Vancouver knocking off Colorado. I've seen people say, well, this system means that a mediocre team like Montreal could win the Stanley Cup. Yep, and I remember 1991 when a very mediocre Minnesota North Stars made the Stanley Cup final. I remember 82 when a very mediocre Vancouver Canucks did it, right after Minnesota North Stars did it in 81, which was unexpected. You've had a league now where now we've got about half the league missing and half the league making it, but there is some desire to expand playoffs. We as fans don't like it. I remember when baseball had just your division winners make the playoffs, meaning 4 teams. That was it. You had your championship series in the National League, championship series in the American League, and then the World Series. And the problem for that was you had a lot of fan bases that didn't have games that meant anything early. And the NHL is flirting with that themselves. While we have the 3-point system, that means no team's really ever truly out of it, unless you're Detroit, in which case, pretty much. But that was a design by Yzerman right out of the starting gates. Like, well, I can't fix this, so we're just going to have to tear it down. And so I don't think that we should necessarily just view this as expanded playoffs. And I know that's how it's being portrayed. I think the idea of having a wild card system, and I don't mean 24, I mean like having just 20. So you have your 7 and 8 seeds play 9 and 10. I think that could help. Look at Montreal last year. Not this year, but last year. Last year, they finished with, 96 points and just missed the playoffs? Would have made the playoffs in the West. A lot of angry Montreal fans. Put them in a play-in game against Columbus. Stick them in a play-in game against Columbus. See how that turns out. How many times have we seen a team just miss the playoffs that fan base for ages would be like, oh man, if we had just had one more game, we were so close. Well, now you'd have that. And it doesn't have to be a best of 5. It could be a wild card game. Could be a best 2 out of 3. And again, it's not officially playoffs. Like this doesn't really fundamentally change it. I mean, it's a one-off. And the reason they're doing it is simple. You can look at Montreal and say, well, they weren't going to make the playoffs. They weren't eliminated. And certainly it's possible they could have gone on a run. The Rangers weren't eliminated either. The Rangers weren't that far out. And out west you got Chicago. Well, they weren't officially eliminated either. And the only teams in the West that are officially out of this would be the California teams, which, again, I don't think anybody's going to complain about. And just remember, too, that in the end, if a team that's in the best of 5 here wins the Stanley Cup, they have to win 19 games to win the Stanley Cup. They have to win more games to get to the Stanley Cup and win it than any other team in NHL history ever has, if you count these as playoffs. If you don't count these as playoffs, then they have 16 wins to get to the playoffs. I just, I'm glad the conversation's kind of changed, and I'm not saying oh, public health doesn't matter, because it does, obviously. That's why they're looking at hub cities. That's why they're looking at no fans in attendance. That's why they're looking at doing this in centralized locations. The reseeding that I've seen people talk about, reseeding doesn't work. Because, it doesn't work if you have hub cities of 6 teams. So if you have, let's say, these 6 are in Columbus, these 6 are in Vegas, these 6 are in Edmonton, these 6 are in Vancouver, whatever you're going to do, right? So if you're going to have a situation where you can do reseedings, you might be taking players from Columbus and sending them to Vegas, from Edmonton to Vancouver, and you're trying to minimize travel as much as possible. For this to work, you have to minimize travel. It's something that I think Major League Baseball is going to take. Major League Baseball's plan it sounds bonkers to me. This one, again, I understand there are going to be risks involved, but we'll see what happens. And I do wonder, are teams really that scared of Carey Price getting hot that we would have a system where it's best of 5 instead of best of 3, in part because of Carey Price? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And for people who are asking about the conditional picks, we just don't know. So if your team has a conditional pick, and you're wondering, so what if we're in this round but we lose it? Does that mean that we have to give up a pick? Does that mean we keep it? GMs are allowed to talk to one another and renegotiate those trades. It is a first in NHL history, and obviously it is a special exemption because of what we're going through. So I would think, honestly, with the draft order and all of that, conditional picks, like for Vancouver's, for instance, if Vancouver lost the play-in against Minnesota, I would think you go to New Jersey and say, you know what, you're better off taking this year's because next year's isn't lottery protected, and we know that this year's isn't going to be a top 3 pick. Something along those lines. But it'll be interesting to see how that works out. And again, whatever they decide, I'm here. And remember, for anybody saying, well, Boston's going to get screwed over because they were the number 1 seed and they should get all kinds of special. Yeah, I remember when this jersey was worn by Boston and they were number 1, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter. So, may the best team win. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.